What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming.
The city never truly slept, but some corners of it seemed forgotten by time. PS 118 stood on the edge of Queens, a red brick building from the 1930s that had survived decades of budget cuts, gentrification waves, and the quiet neglect that often befell public schools in New York. Its windows were tall and narrow, framed in dark metal, and when the last bell rang and the children filed out, the place seemed to exhale a tired breath. By nightfall, the school looked almost medieval, its silhouette jagged against the sodium orange glow of streetlights. For most people, PS 118 was just another school. For the teachers who worked late, for the janitors who swept its corridors long after dusk, it was something else entirely. Miriam Flores had taught here for 12 years. She loved her work, the smell of chalk dust, the little murals painted on the walls, the squeak of sneakers during recess. But she didn't love staying late. Parent-teacher conferences, staff meetings, standardized test prep, they all had a way of stretching into the night. Tonight was one of those nights. She had stayed behind to grade essays. The children had been tasked with writing about their dreams, what they wanted to be when they grew up. It should have been a pleasant read, but something about the emptiness of the school as she sat alone in her classroom made the words take on a strange weight. The building creaked around her. The pipes ticked like far-off footsteps. Miriam's classroom was on the 3rd floor, at the far end of a long corridor lined with lockers. She had left the door open for the sake of hearing the janitor's cart, for knowing that she wasn't completely alone. But then around 8:15 p.m., she heard something that made her freeze mid-sentence. Footsteps, not the rolling rattle of a janitor's mop bucket, not the heavy, confident stride of a security guard. These were light, quick, playful, the unmistakable patter of a child running down the hall. Her red pen hovered above the paper. She waited. The sound came again, closer this time. Just outside her classroom, Miriam slowly rose from her chair and peered into the hallway. Empty. Her eyes swept the lockers, the scuffed linoleum floors, the bulletin boards covered in crookedly cut construction paper. No one. A chill crawled up her spine. She glanced down the hall toward the stairwell, half expecting to see a child darting out of sight. Nothing moved. She told herself it was just the building. Old wood settled at night. Pipes expanded and contracted. The brain invented sounds when it was tired. But as she sat back down, she felt something she couldn't explain, an electric tension in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The history of PS 118. PS 118 had been built in 1934 during the Great Depression, part of a citywide initiative to provide better education for the growing population of immigrant children. It was a sturdy building, with wide staircases and polished wooden banisters built to last. Over the years, the neighborhood changed. Families came and went, but the school remained, a kind of anchor in the middle of shifting tides. There were stories, of course. Every old building has them. Teachers whispered about strange noises at night, about doors opening by themselves, about the occasional glimpse of movement on the security cameras when no one was supposed to be there. The oldest staff members remembered a tragedy in the 1960s, a fire that had claimed the lives of 2 students who had been hiding in the basement during a game of hide-and-seek. The school had been repaired, scrubbed clean of soot and ash, but the story never quite went away. The basement in particular was avoided unless absolutely necessary. The first real encounter. Miriam tried to put the sound of footsteps out of her mind. She stacked the essays into neat piles, grabbed her coat, and decided to leave. The hallway was darker than she expected. The motion sensor lights should have clicked on as soon as she stepped out, but for a moment they didn't. In the silence, she heard it again. Patter, patter, patter. This time, followed by a faint giggle. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the far end of the hall, and for just a fraction of a second, she thought she saw a shape. Small, child-sized, standing in the faint glow of the exit sign. Then the light flickered, and it was gone. Her heart was hammering by the time she reached the stairwell. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heels clicking against the steps. The lobby was deserted. The security guard's desk was empty. Strange, because he was usually there until 9. Miriam forced herself to breathe. "It's just an old building," she muttered under her breath. "It's just the wind." But as she stepped outside, she glanced up at the third-floor windows, and there, staring down from her own classroom, was the pale outline of a face. Setting the stage, that night marked the beginning of a series of events that would pull Miriam and everyone else connected to PS-118 into something they could not explain. In the coming weeks, teachers reported hearing laughter in empty halls. Security cameras caught blurred figures darting across classrooms. Janitors swore they found tiny handprints on the windows each morning, as though someone had pressed their palms against the glass during the night. The principal tried to keep things quiet. The school board hated bad publicity, and the city was always quick to dismiss ghost stories as urban legends. But the tension was building, and those who spent the most time inside the school felt it growing stronger by the day. For Miriam, it became personal. She began to dream about the school at night, dreams that felt more like memories. She saw children she didn't recognize, running through the hallways, their faces blurred. She smelled smoke, felt the sting of heat on her skin, heard the sound of coughing and crying, and always somewhere in the distance, she heard footsteps, the empty classrooms the next morning. Miriam walked into PS-118 with a sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. The hallways were loud again, echoing with the sounds of sneakers and chatter, but it was as though she could still feel the silence from the night before, as if it had left a residue on the walls. She passed by the janitor, Mr. Alvarez, who was mopping near the entrance. He was a man in his late 60s, skin darkened by years of labor, his face lined and weary but kind. "You were here late last night," he said, not looking up from his work. "Yes," Miriam admitted. "Did you hear anything around 8? Someone running?" Mr. Alvarez paused, leaning on his mop. His eyes flicked toward the stairwell before returning to her. "Sometimes," he said carefully. "The building makes noises. Don't stay too late by yourself." It was the kind of answer that sounded like advice but also like a warning. Colleagues start to notice during lunch break. Miriam brought it up to two of her colleagues, Ms. Price and Mr. Lang. They were sitting in the staff lounge, eating sandwiches and grading papers. Miss Price, a cheerful woman in her 50s with a laugh that could fill a room, frowned when Miriam mentioned hearing footsteps. "That's funny," she said slowly. "I was here Tuesday night and I heard something too. I thought it was the after-school program, but when I went to look, the place was empty." Mr. Lang chuckled, but it didn't sound amused. "This school's always been creepy after hours. You ever go down to the basement alone? It's like walking into a refrigerator." "There's a reason for that," Ms. Price said. "You know what happened in the 60s. Miriam nodded. "The fire." "Yeah," Ms. Price said softly. "My mother actually went here when she was little." She said the fire started in the furnace room. 2 boys hid in one of the storage closets. They didn't make it out. The staff room grew quiet. Mr. Lang broke the silence. "Buildings remember things," he said with a shrug, as if he were talking about something as mundane as leaky pipes. Miriam went back to her classroom with goosebumps running up her arms. Miriam stays late again. Despite her fear, Miriam stayed after school again that Thursday. Part of her told herself she wanted to prove there was nothing strange going on, that she had simply been tired and jumpy. Another part of her, one she didn't want to admit existed, was curious. The school after dark was a different creature entirely. The hallways felt longer, the classrooms seemed deeper, the buzzing of the overhead lights took on a low, almost angry tone. Around 7:45, Miriam heard the first sound, a ball bouncing, one sharp thump, then another. Her heart thudded in her chest. The gymnasium was on the other side of the building, and no one was supposed to be there this late. She stepped into the hallway. The sound stopped. She made her way toward the stairwell, each step echoing in the emptiness. When she reached the second floor, she stopped cold. A single red rubber ball sat at the far end of the hall. It shouldn't have been there. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Miriam walked toward it. When she was 5 feet away, the ball rolled, not away from her, toward her. Her breath caught in her throat. It rolled until it tapped gently against her shoe, and then, from somewhere just behind her, came the sound of tiny footsteps running away. Miriam spun. Around nothing, just the hallway stretching into darkness. She grabbed her coat and left the building so quickly. She barely remembered locking her classroom door. The dreams grow stronger that night. Miriam dreamed again. She was in the school, but it was not the school as she knew it. The walls were scorched black. The air was filled with smoke. She could hear children crying, calling for their mothers. And in the center of the hallway stood two boys. They were maybe 8 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, suspenders, short pants. Their faces were pale, streaked with soot. They were holding hands, and both of them were staring at her. When Miriam woke, her pillow was damp with sweat. The history deepens. The next day, Miriam visited the local public library. She spent hours combing through old newspaper microfilms, searching for records of the 1960s fire. She found a short article dated March 17, 1963. 2 boys died in school fire, Queens. A small fire broke out in the basement of PS 118 yesterday afternoon. Though all students were evacuated, 2 boys were later discovered in a storage closet where they had apparently been hiding. Their names are being withheld pending notification of the family. There was no follow-up article, no mention of the funeral, no photographs, nothing. It was as though the story had been buried as quickly as possible. When Miriam left the library, the wind was biting cold. She thought about the boys from her dream, and she thought about the ball rolling toward her in the empty hallway. A building that watches over the next week. Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that the school was aware of her. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the light seemed to follow her movements. She began to notice other things too. Sometimes, when she arrived early in the morning, she would find her classroom door slightly ajar, even though she was certain she had locked it the night before. Once, she discovered her stack of graded essays had been moved from her desk to a child's chair in the corner. And once, very early, she thought she heard someone humming, a nursery rhyme, soft and tuneless. When she stepped into the hallway, it stopped. The tension was building, slow and relentless. Whatever haunted PS 118 had begun to take notice of Miriam, and Miriam, against her better judgment, was beginning to take notice of it. The school was no longer just a place where she worked. It had become something else entirely, a presence, a puzzle, a shadow that was growing darker by the day. The building that breathed the second incident. The following Monday, Miriam arrived to find a note slipped under her classroom door. It wasn't from a parent or student. This was plain paper, no name, no date. Stop staying after dark, that was all it said. Her stomach twisted as she read the words again. The handwriting was small and shaky, as if written in haste. When she asked the security guard, Mr. Cohen, if he had seen anyone near her room over the weekend, he shook his head. No one should have been in the building. I was on duty Saturday morning. I would have seen them. Mr. Cohen was a big man, former NYPD, the kind who rarely showed fear. But as Miriam told him about the ball in the hallway, about the footsteps, about the face in the window, his expression tightened. This place has stories, he said finally. I've seen things on the cameras I can't explain. Blurry figures in the halls, motion sensors going off when no one's there. Look, if you're staying late, call me. I'll do a sweep of your floor first. Night watch that night. Miriam stayed again, partly because she had work, partly because she wanted to see what would happen. At 7:30, Mr. Cohen came by her classroom. All clear, he said. Though his voice was less confident than usual, Miriam thanked him and kept working. At 8:20, the first sound came. Not footsteps this time, singing. It was faint, like the memory of music. A child's voice, lilting and thin, carrying through the vents. Ring-a-ring-a roses. Miriam froze, pen in hand. The song echoed down the hall, too soft to tell exactly where it was coming from. She stood and stepped out of her classroom. The hallway was dark except for the emergency lights. The singing stopped and then a door slammed. Not just any door, the one to the basement. The basement. Miriam hesitated at the top of the stairs. The basement was always cold, always smelling faintly of mildew and cleaner. She descended slowly, her footsteps loud against the concrete. Halfway down, the air grew colder. At the bottom, the basement stretched out in 2 directions, one toward the boiler room, the other toward a row of storage closets. A single fluorescent bulb flickered overhead. Something moved at the far end of the hall. It was just a shadow, there and gone in an instant, but Miriam heard it. Laughter, soft, breathless, childlike. And then, the ball rolled past her feet. It came out of nowhere, as if pushed by unseen hands. Her body locked up, fear rooting her to the spot. Then from behind one of the storage doors came a sound that turned her blood to ice. A knock. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Miriam stumbled backward up the stairs. She didn't stop until she was back in the lobby, her chest heaving, seeking answers. The next day, Miriam told Ms. Price what had happened. "You need to stop staying after dark," Ms. Price said. "I can't," Miriam replied. "I have to know what's happening." Ms. Price hesitated, then nodded toward the basement door. "Ask Alvarez. He's been here since the 80s. He knows more than he lets on." Miriam found Mr. Alvarez in the supply closet, restocking cleaning fluid. "Tell me about the basement," she said without preamble. Mr. Alvarez stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You want the truth? People don't like to talk about it, but the fire didn't just take 2 boys. Some say there was a third, never officially listed, never found." The parents moved away. No funeral. He glanced toward the basement door, his voice dropping lower. "Sometimes when I'm down there alone, I hear crying. Sometimes I hear a boy calling for his brother." The security footage that night. Mr. Cohen called Miriam to the security office. "You should see this," he said grimly. On the monitor, the 3rd floor hallway appeared empty. Then slowly, faintly, a figure came into view. Small, child-sized. It walked toward the camera, barefoot, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, just before it would have come into focus, the footage distorted, static tearing across the screen, before the figure vanished entirely. "This was last night," Mr. Cohen said. "Your hallway, right outside your classroom." Miriam's skin crawled. Dreams turned to nightmares that night. Miriam's dream was different. She was standing in the basement again. But this time she wasn't alone. The 2 Soot Street boys were there, holding hands, but behind them stood another child, smaller, thinner, his face hidden in shadow. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper that rattled in her bones. "Find me." Miriam woke with tears on her cheeks. Escalation. From then on, the activity intensified. Teachers reported hearing running footsteps in the middle of the day, though no children were in the hall. The art teacher discovered one of her paintings defaced overnight, with crude childlike drawings of stick figures standing in fire. And in Miriam's classroom, the chalkboard began to erase itself. Words would appear in shaky handwriting. "Play, stay downstairs." Miriam no longer felt she was imagining things. Whatever haunted PS-118 wanted her attention, and was no longer subtle about it. By the close of Part 2, Miriam is fully drawn into the mystery. The entity is no longer shy. It is actively communicating, escalating, urging her deeper into the school's past. The basement has become the focal point, a place that seems to breathe and watch and wait. Into the heart of the school descent, Miriam knew she couldn't keep ignoring the basement. It had become the center of her nightmares. The whispered words on the chalkboard, the strange sounds at night. The 2 boys she saw in her dreams were always standing there, waiting, and the 3rd shadow, the one that whispered "Find me," had begun to appear in her waking life. Thursday evening, she stayed after dark again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Mr. Cohen had agreed to stay with her. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said, strapping on his flashlight. "But something's going on here, and I'd rather know what it is than keep guessing." They descended the basement stairs together. The air was cold and damp, smelling of rust and old water. Miriam's flashlight beam cut across the concrete floor, catching the glint of a metal bucket, the faint graffiti from generations of children who had scrawled their names here during detention. Then they reached the furnace room door. It was slightly open, and beyond it, they heard it, laughter, faint, high-pitched, unmistakably that of children. The basement reveals itself. They stepped inside. The furnace loomed in the center of the room, its metal sides covered in decades of soot. The pipes overhead rattled faintly, and then, with no warning, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Miriam spun around. The room was suddenly darker, the single overhead bulb flickering as though struggling to stay lit. On the floor, dust began to stir, slowly at first, then forming a circular pattern, as if something unseen were running in a circle around them. Miriam gripped Mr. Cohen's arm. He swore under his breath and aimed his flashlight toward the far wall. And there they were. Two boys, standing side by side just as Miriam had seen in her dreams. Their faces were pale, their hair matted, their eyes dark pools that reflected the weak light. They didn't move, they only stared. Then from the far corner, something else stepped forward. The third child, smaller, his face obscured, head tilted at a grotesque angle. When he spoke, the sound was not just heard. It vibrated in the walls, in Miriam's teeth, in the very air. He left me here. The truth emerges. Miriam's breath came in shallow gasps. Who? She whispered. My brother. The two soot-covered boys turned their heads slowly toward the smaller figure, their faces unreadable. And suddenly the room shifted. The basement was no longer the basement. The air filled with smoke. The furnace glowed red-hot. Miriam could hear the crackle of flames, the screams of children, the panicked shouts of teachers. She was in the fire. Mr. Cohen shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the roar. The two boys began to run, their small hands still clasped together. They disappeared into the storage closet, and Miriam understood. This was their last moment alive. The third child remained where he was, staring at her. I waited. The fire grew hotter, the smoke thicker. Miriam dropped to her knees, coughing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The basement was quiet again. But something had changed. On the wall behind the furnace, a section of concrete had cracked, revealing a narrow opening. The discovery, Mr. Cohen aimed his flashlight into the hole. Inside was a small space, no bigger than a crawl space, and in that space was a skeleton, small child-sized, curled into a ball as though trying to hide. Miriam covered her mouth with her hands. The third child, the one who had never been found. The spirit's demand. The air grew heavy, pressing against Miriam's chest. The figure of the third child was still there, his outline faint now, almost transparent. You found me, he said, and then louder, shaking the room. Don't leave me. The furnace roared to life, the pipes screaming with heat. The overhead bulb shattered, plunging them into darkness. Something unseen grabbed Miriam's wrist, cold and strong, pulling her toward the crawlspace. Mr. Cohen yanked her back. We're leaving, he shouted, dragging her toward the door. It resisted, as though an invisible hand held it shut. For a moment, Miriam thought they were trapped, that the school would keep them here forever. Then, with a final deafening bang, the door flew open, slamming against the wall. They ran. The aftermath, when they reached the lobby, both of them were shaking. Mr. Cohen locked the basement door behind them, his hands trembling. What the hell was that? He demanded, his voice cracking. Miriam couldn't answer, because she knew it wasn't over. That night, she dreamed again, but this time, the dream was different. The third child was standing in the hallway, no longer shadowed. His face was visible now, pale and gaunt, but somehow peaceful. He pointed toward the basement, and then toward her. Tell them, he whispered. The haunting has reached its climax. Miriam has discovered the truth. The third child who died and was never found. The spirit is no longer merely frightening. It is demanding justice, remembrance, acknowledgement. But the school is still dangerous, still alive, still unpredictable.
The school does not let Gothy burden. Miriam barely slept after the basement incident. When she arrived at PS 118 the next morning, the building seemed quieter than usual, as if watching her. She found Ms. Price in the lounge and told her everything. The laughter, the vision of the fire, the hidden crawl space, the skeleton. Ms. Price's face went pale. You have to tell the principal, she whispered. But when Miriam sat in Principal Henderson's office later that day, she hesitated. How could she explain what she had seen without sounding insane? She spoke carefully. There may be remains in the basement. Behind the furnace, Principal Henderson blinked at her. Remains? Yes, Miriam said. A child, from the fire in 1963. No one ever found him. Principal Henderson's expression hardened. Miriam, that fire happened 60 years ago. There's nothing back there but pipes and dust. If you're feeling stressed, maybe you should take a few days off. Her dismissal felt cold, final. But Miriam couldn't stop thinking about the boy's whisper. Tell them. Signs and warnings that night. The school sent its own message. When Miriam arrived the next morning, her classroom door was wide open. On the chalkboard in jagged letters was a single word. Liar, her students hadn't even arrived yet. She stood frozen, heart hammering, until Ms. Price stepped in. "Oh my God," she breathed. The letters began to fade before their eyes, as if an invisible hand were erasing them. The school board meeting against the principal's advice. Miriam brought her concerns to the district office, but the more she explained, the more skeptical they became. "Do you have evidence?" a board member asked. No, not physical evidence." "Then we have nothing to act on." "You're talking about opening up school property on the basis of visions?" When Miriam left the meeting, she felt a chill in her chest. Not just fear, but anger. The boy wanted to be found. The school wanted him to stay buried. The final descent. That night, Miriam returned. This time, she was alone. The hallways were deathly silent. The lights buzzed faintly, casting long, warped shadows on the floor. She unlocked the basement door with Mr. Cohen's spare key, her hands shaking. The air below was colder than ever, thick with the scent of dust and iron. She walked straight to the furnace room. The crack in the wall was still there. Miriam crouched and looked into the crawl space. The skeleton was there, but something was different. It was sitting upright now, its skull tilted toward her, and next to it, scrawled on the wall in black soot, were words she hadn't seen before. "You promised." Miriam's throat tightened. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'll tell them. I swear." The room grew warmer, almost unbearably so, until sweat ran down her back. And then the whisper came, soft but unmistakable, right next to her ear. "Stay." The choice. The heat surged. The furnace roared to life, glowing red. The basement door slammed shut. Miriam stumbled backward, coughing. The air grew so hot she thought her skin might blister. And then, just like in the vision, the two soot-streaked boys appeared, holding hands. They were crying. They pointed toward the crawl space, then toward the stairs, as though telling her to run. The smaller boy, the forgotten one, stood in the doorway, blocking her escape. His head tilted slowly, until it was nearly upside down. Miriam's body shook with terror. "I can't stay," she said. "I'm alive. I don't belong here." For a long moment there was silence, and then, slowly, the boy stepped aside. The door swung open. Miriam fled up the stairs. The empty hallway. When she reached the third floor, she stopped to catch her breath. The hallway was dark, lit only by the exit signs, and then she heard it. Patter, patter, patter. The sound of children running. She turned her head and saw them. Dozens of them, translucent, sprinting past her in both directions. Boys and girls, some laughing, some crying, their faces flickering like old film. And at the far end of the hallway, standing completely still, was the third child, watching her, waiting. The next morning, Miriam didn't show up to work. Her car was still parked outside the school. Her classroom door was locked from the inside. When Mr. Cohen finally broke it open, the room was empty. On the chalkboard, written in small, neat handwriting, was a single sentence. "He is not alone anymore." No one ever saw Miriam Flores again. The principal had the basement wall sealed. The district refused to comment on her disappearance. But sometimes at night, the security cameras catch something moving in the hallways. A figure walking slowly, barefoot, head tilted slightly to the side. And if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a teacher's voice, faint and distant, calling roll for a class that no longer exists. PS 118 remains open to this day. The children still run in the playground. The parents still attend PTA meetings, but the teachers whisper about the nights when the footsteps return, when the laughter echoes through the halls, when the basement door rattles though no one is there. And sometimes, if you pass by after dark and look up at the third floor window, you might see a woman standing there, watching, waiting.